No, you're not crazy. You can hear the difference between the vinyl version and the streaming version of your favorite album. So today we're going to talk about mastering for streaming versus mastering for vinyl, what the differences are, why they're important, and some ways that you can think about and approach mastering for these two different formats. So let's go. So mastering for vinyl and mastering for streaming need a different approach depending on the material. And today I'm going to talk you through how I think about and how I approach mastering for both of these formats. And I'm going to go through three kind of main fundamental points to help you get better understanding and get a better sound when it comes to your masters. So let's get started with the first and a super important point, and that is dynamics and compression. So when it comes to audio, dynamics and dynamic range is a really important part, and both vinyl and streaming have very different needs when it comes to this. And if you're not quite sure what I'm talking about with dynamics, in a nutshell, it's the difference between the quieter parts of a song and the louder parts of a song. And the bigger the difference between those, then the more dynamic range it would have. And if it's, say, if you think about like maybe a techno tune, dance stuff, or like a metal, heavy metal track where it starts loud, it's loud in the middle, and it's loud at the end, then that's a track where you'd say it doesn't have a very large dynamic range. So dynamics are kind of like the life and the energy of a track and of an instrument. And every different instrument and voice has its own inherent dynamic range. Some people talk really loud all the time, so they haven't got a very big dynamic range. Some people can talk very quietly and talk very loud. Same with instruments and music. Some genres, some artists have lots of dynamic range going, and that can add some life and add a bit of like emotion and stuff like that to tracks. And some are just plain loud and in your face, and you know that has its own place too. So when it comes to vinyl versus streaming, what are we looking at with dynamics? So basically, in a nutshell, without me waffling on too much, vinyl favors a larger dynamic range. It favors having that energy, those dynamics present. And streaming, whilst it might be important for some genres, is less concerned with the dynamic range and more concerned with an overall loud master. And I'm going to show you what I mean. I'm going to transfer over to Studio One, where I've got some tracks here. And as you can see up at the top, this is, or maybe not as you can see, this might not be obvious to some of you, but up at the top, we have a quieter audio file. Then it gets a little bit louder down here on the blue track, and then it gets even louder on the yellow. And what's going on here is this top one is the original mix that someone sent me. The bottom one is the vinyl master that I've done for it. And then the bottom one here, sorry, I think I just said bottom there. I meant the middle one is the vinyl master. The bottom one here is the louder streaming master. So you might be able to just tell by looking at these what's going on here, but let's explain it just in case you don't know. So this is quite an even mix already. The green track up at the top is the original mix. It's quite nice and even, but there's still waveform peaks here. Nothing is squared off or too squashed. It's just a thick, kind of dense sounding mix. So I've kept that for the vinyl master here, and I've added some compression to make sure it's still nice and even, and there's not going to be any surprises for the cutting engineer or to the cutting head. And it's still maintaining a little bit of dynamic range, about as much as the mix, where you can kind of see there's a bit of a thicker bit here, so that's a bit of a louder part of the mix, and it's a bit quieter either side of that. But then if we look down to the streaming mix, we can see that it's just really squared off the whole way through, and that's because it's been pushed to get more loudness. It's been pushed into some clipping and limiting processing, which tend to square off the waveforms. So how would you approach mastering for vinyl and streaming with that in mind? Well, as I said before, vinyl favors that dynamic range. You still need some level of control, and compression is very useful for that. But you want to make sure the waveforms are still intact. We don't want to be squaring off the waveforms with digital processing like clipping and limiting most of the time for most genres. There are instances where, for louder dance type stuff, for instance, you might provide a more squared off waveform to your cutting engineer. And there's quite a few reasons for that. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but basically it's a trade-off between subtle high frequency distortion and getting loudness. And for some genres, the subtle high frequency distortion that squaring off waveforms introduces is not as audible, and it's worth the trade-off to get a much louder cut onto vinyl for some genres. If you think about heavier stuff and dance sort of stuff, where there's a lot of thick sort of frequency stuff going on, if there is a tiny bit of subtle high frequency distortion, it might not be as audible and noticeable over everything else that's going on in the mix. So some artists will choose to say, do you know what, I'm not as fussed about the super high fidelity, high end. I just want a really loud sort of banging master, or, you know, super loud record. But in general, like I say, the vinyl favors dynamics. Some control with compression helps, and you have to really fine tune that to get the right settings. That's a whole another video for another time where I will go into that, because it's actually quite interesting for us audio nerds anyway. And then moving on to streaming, dynamics for the streaming masters, as you saw, they're a lot more squared off, so we can use clipping and limiting processing that does square off a waveform, but that gives us a bit more headroom, and it gives us an overall louder and a consistently loud master, which people want these days, especially on streaming platforms. So moving on to point number 2, and that is frequency and EQ. So again, vinyl masters and streaming masters have different needs. For streaming masters, we can be a lot more liberal, and we can be a lot more creative with the overall frequency response, the overall stereo image, and the kind of EQ that we're adding or subtracting. There's nothing inherent about streaming platforms or playback devices that are going to cause any issues. Obviously, we want to make a good sounding master. If stuff's too bright, it's going to sound harsh. If stuff's way too bassy, it's going to distort and sound like flabby and horrible. But with vinyl, there are a few things we have to be really careful of, and that is all to do with how vinyl is cut and how a cutting head works. Now, I've gone a bit more into depth in other videos about this, and I'll do other videos specifically about how cutting heads work and how they actually cut grooves into vinyl. But for now, we're just going to kind of cover the approach kind of thing. So vinyl needs a careful, considered approach to low end, especially if there's anything that's been panned out to the sides. And that's to do with the way the cutting head works. So if you have stereo low end information, the cutting head struggles with that. So basically you're going to get skips. So to mitigate that and to make sure we get a good sounding cut for your vinyl master, you want to make sure that you don't have any stereo low end, or if you do, that has to be communicated to your cutting engineer, and there are certain things that they can do, like bring the overall volume down of a cut to help with that. But in general, we want to remove low end from the sides, and we can do that with an elliptical filter. I have one down here on my for my outboard, and I have a mid-side EQ here, and I can use the filter part of that to just filter off all the low ends. That's getting a bit, I don't know why my hand's blurry, but it is. So you can also get plugins that do that, and basically that's an EQ that removes low end from the sides, and doing that is going to help ensure that we get a nice loud cut when it comes to the cutting of the record, and it's going to mitigate lots of problems with the cutting head. Now, there might be occasions when the mix has some stereo low end on purpose, and like I said before, if that is the case, then you can talk to your cutting engineer and have a conversation about that and say, look, this has got stereo low end, but it's kind of, I've done the mix that way on purpose. Can you have a look, see if it'll cut, and let the cutting engineer sort of do a test and get back to you about that. But in general, most things, if you are getting vinyl cut, you want to avoid stereo low end if possible. Now, the next biggest thing that we have to consider with our approach to mastering for vinyl is sibilance and high end. So S's, T's, P's, and excessive, like cymbals, excessive bursts of high end can stress the cutter head. Basically, for higher frequencies, the cutting head moves quicker. So if there's loads of those and sudden big bursts and S's and cymbals, stuff like that, the cutting head struggles to move that fast to replicate that sound, and that can lead to high frequency distortion. So if there's a lot of high end in your mix or on the master, then that's something to reduce with EQ, with de-essers, to ensure, again, you get a nice even cut when it comes to the vinyl. So approach wise, for vinyl, we're thinking stereo low end, get rid of it, and we're thinking high end, be careful of sibilance and any excessive kind of cymbals and fast, like high end transient stuff. And then for streaming, there's those things aren't really as important. If people are listening on earbuds quite a lot, as they do off streaming platforms, maybe you want some stereo low end, maybe you want a really wide image with lots of panning, and that's okay, that's fine. Again, we still want a good sounding master, we don't want anything distorting, and with the brightness, although it's not as important as it is for vinyl, obviously we don't want it too bright where it's going to distort and hurt people's ears because they're going to stop listening. So yeah, so that's the kind of two different approaches. Safety stuff for vinyl, and it's more of the aesthetic stuff for streaming, just making sure it sounds good. So moving on to point 3, and that is loudness. Now again, we're taking two kind of opposite approaches. For vinyl, there's no set loudness we're aiming for. The actual loudness of a vinyl master doesn't matter, because the cutting engineer can boost or cut your track so that it cuts at a decent loudness. They'll have their own amplifiers and settings and stuff that they're going to run, and they'll know their specific cutting lathe really well. So it doesn't really matter. You don't have to aim for a set LUFS reading or a set dBFS reading. You just have to take into considerations the things we've already talked about. Now for streaming, it's a lot different, and it's a hotly contested topic when it comes to loudness. Most people want things loud. That's the truth of it. The loudness war has never gone away. It's always been there. And that's just because of the way we perceive things. If you turn something up a little bit, people go, oh yeah, that sounds better. And there's loads of tests. You can search them on sort of YouTube, where people have tested the same master and just turned it up 1 or 2 dBs, and people always pick the louder one, even though it's exactly the same. So when it comes to mastering for streaming, we are thinking about, let's get this thing nice and loud, because people want it to sit amongst other tracks at a similar loudness. You don't want your track to be on a playlist with loads of others and then it suddenly drop in volume and sound a bit softer and quieter, because no matter how good it sounds, if it is loads quieter, people will just be like, oh, that, you know, doesn't have the impact. So people might see it or hear it less favorably. So with the streaming masters, the way to approach that is, obviously we're still wanting quality. We don't want to sacrifice anything just to get it loud, but if we can make it sound really good and get it nice and loud at the same time, that's what we're going for. And this generally is done with all the usual tools that you would think about: EQ, compression, and then putting processing like clipping and limiting on the end of that, so that we can shave off transients, shave off peaks of the audio. That gives us more headroom to push the track a little bit louder. And like I said, this is the stage where you've got to be careful, because loud for loudness' sake isn't worth sacrificing the quality of the track. You don't want things to distort. And you can hear it all the time when people have just pushed things into a limiter way too much, and it actually starts to sound less quiet because there's no impact and everything is a bit muffled. It sounds like it's got a blanket over it almost. So the approach that I take is go for a good loudness. I kind of trust my ears before I start even looking at readings or LUFS readings or anything like that. I'm kind of just using my ears as a guide. I'll push something into a limiter to get a bit of loudness and try and find that sweet spot. There's no set LUFS reading to aim for really. It's completely dependent on the genre, on the actual tune. But there's a lot of false information about mastering for Spotify and aiming for -14 LUFS. Don't aim for -14 LUFS. That's not a thing anyone has ever said. Spotify didn't ever say that. A lot of people just didn't understand what Spotify said about that. And here it is in a nutshell. Spotify said that on playlists or on the platforms, when normalization is turned on, which is not on some devices by default, then they will normalize everything to -14 LUFS. So if it's quieter, they bring it up. If it's louder, they bring it down. And what you'll find is most commercial music is mastered a lot louder than that. And so when that normalization function is turned on, Spotify will just bring the volume down. And that's purely for playlists. They don't want people having to change the volume between every song and get frustrated with the platform and end up not listening on Spotify basically. So it's just their way of leveling loads of different masters from loads of different artists all over the world for the listener. So ignore the -14 thing. It's a myth from people who don't understand what they're talking about. Ignore that. Most stuff is mastered a bit louder than that. Some stuff is mastered way louder than that. Again, it's all dependent on genre. So there you go. That's the three main sort of points that I think about and help me approach making these masters for different formats. So we'll do a quick recap. So vinyl versus streaming. Number one, we're thinking about dynamics. Vinyl prefers dynamics, streaming not quite as important. Number two is frequency. There's a couple of set things we need to do for vinyl, and that's make sure there's not loads of stereo low end, and make sure the high end sibilant kind of material is under control. Whereas for streaming, that's not as important. We can get away with a lot more. And finally, loudness. There's no set loudness to aim for your vinyl masters, but with streaming, we're mastering with loudness in mind a lot more so, and we're trying to go for those louder masters because that's what people want. So there you go. I hope that's been interesting. Hope that's been helpful. And if you've got any questions about this kind of stuff, cutting records, mastering for vinyl, or mastering in general, then drop me a comment below. Like I said, I kind of want this channel to be more about mindset and approach to stuff rather than showing you a plugin setting that I might use. But who knows, we might do a bit of that as well. And I've got some very cool tracks that artists are going to let me use to do video walkthroughs of that stuff once they're already released. So that's coming up. Also, make sure you go check out Record Cutting Club if you've not seen any episodes of that. That's a vlog series that I've done with my friend Anna from Rydor DI Recordings, and we invite artists into the studio here, do a little interview, and then we go and cut a record with them, and we talk about all things mastering, vinyl, music industry, and sort of navigating that as an independent artist. So there's a few up already, there's loads more coming. We've got some very cool guests booked in to come and do those sessions, so go and check them out. And that's it for today. As always, hope everyone's well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.